Some proponents of theistic evolution today try to argue that the Christian doctrine of creation is a secondary doctrine, and it's not very important to the Christian faith. All you need to do is believe in Jesus. You don't really need to have an understanding of God as creator. I say this is really a misreading of the Christian tradition from the very beginning. The idea that God is a creator and created all things and brought them all into existence out of nothing as part of his loving and intentional plan is really a foundational doctrine of what C.S. Lewis might call mere Christianity. And it wasn't a secondary doctrine at all. Now, this is to distinguish the Christian doctrine of creation from creationism, which is the more recent idea of trying to fit the biblical text into a certain reading of what science says, and to use the book of Genesis really as a science textbook, and more recently to argue that you have to believe and say that there were 6 24-hour days, or that the earth only existed for a few thousand years. I'd say that creationism is not a foundational Christian doctrine, but the doctrine of creation, of God as creator of everything and the guider of everything is. Now, again, you have theistic evolutionists like Carl Giberson in his book Saving Darwin saying that creation is just a secondary doctrine. But if you go back to the Christian tradition, you find the exact opposite. In fact, the Nicene Creed, which is accepted by all major branches of the Christian faith for something like almost 1,700 years, what does it start out saying? It's not about Jesus, it's talking about that Christians believe in one God the Father Almighty, creator of all things visible and invisible. Similarly, the early church father Irenaeus, when he began the second book of his book about refuting several heresies, he started not with the doctrine of Christ, but with what he called the most important topic, which was, again, God the Father Almighty, creator of all things. Now, why did the early Christians think that the doctrine of creation was so important? Well, I think they did because they realized that the rest of the Christian story of redemption really makes very little sense if you don't understand that God created things and that he created things good. And so you can't just have Jesus apart from the idea of God as a creator. Where you really get the idea that you can't separate God as creator from, say, belief in Jesus is in the Gospel of John, the first chapter in verse 3, where it talks about that Jesus was the person through whom all things were created, and that there wasn't anything in all of creation that was created except through him. This same teaching is made by Paul in the book of Colossians, also in the Epistle to the Hebrews. The idea that Christ, in fact, was the agent of creation and the way things were created. And so it really isn't true that you can say you just believe in Jesus but can dismiss the idea of God as creator, because in fact the Bible, the New Testament, claims that Jesus in fact was the creator. So it's pretty hard when theistic evolutionists claim that you can separate those two. It turns out that the Gospel of John, according to the church father Irenaeus, was written directly to counter the teaching of the early Gnostics that our world was not created by God the Father Almighty, but by some secondary entity that God appointed to sort of do his own thing, a demiurge that God appointed to create things really apart from God's specific direction and intention. And in fact, to counter that error taught by an early teacher known as Cerinthus, John wrote his gospel. And so the early part of John, especially John 1, where it talks about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that everything was created through him, that was to counter the teaching of the Gnostics that denied that God really was the specific and intentional creator of all that is. And so that really has a lot of relevance to the claims of modern theistic evolutionists that, in fact, God didn't really create things actively. Instead, he was sort of a passive creator and created this entity, this unguided entity of natural selection acting on random variations that was sort of his designer substitute.